I just want to give a very, very brief, very simplified introduction to a few movement science concepts that I think will be helpful as you embark on your movement practice journey. In the notes for this section, I have a number of articles linked, just not for every topic here, but in cases where I knew of an article that explores the concept in a really clear way, I just linked it in the notes. So if what I am saying makes no sense, then hopefully you'll find something in one of those articles that does make sense. So let's start with stretching. To stretch or not to stretch. There's kind of a pervasive myth out there that if your muscles are sore or tight, that you should stretch them. Or if you have an injury, you should stretch it. And that isn't always the most helpful thing to do. And I will tell you why. So the logic behind that assumption is that your muscles, if they're tight, say, that it's because they're short, and so the remedy for short muscles is to just stretch them like they're taffy or silly putty to a longer length. And that this will then make your body feel better and will give you more range of motion at your joints. Well, the problem is it doesn't really work that way. The length of your muscles and the range of motion you have available at your joints is mediated by the nervous system. And the nervous system is only going to allow movement to the degree that it perceives that movement to be safe. So let's take an example where, say, your hips feel tight. You've got tight, maybe sore, maybe stiff hips. And so you think, oh, well, I guess I'll just stretch my hips in order to get more movement there so they won't feel so tight. Well, the problem with that is that it might be that the muscles around your hips are actually weak. And the reason that you're experiencing a sensation of tightness or stiffness is that your nervous system is in fact kind of locking down in that region because it correctly perceives that you don't have strength and control around those joints. So in a case like that, stretching can actually make the problem worse. And I've seen this many, many times where people will experience some area of tightness in their body. They'll keep stretching. It doesn't get better. Sometimes it gets worse. And sometimes the best remedy for that can be to strengthen the area. And then you'll often get that the feeling of tightness will go away because your nervous system is perceiving that there is more control and strength around that joint. So that's sort of one example of how this works. But just to kind of flag for you that stretching doesn't really work the way people typically think that it works. And so you just want to think twice. You'll notice that in the types of movements that I introduce in this course, I don't really have stretching as a important movement. It doesn't mean that I never stretch. There's some stretches that I like to do because they feel good. They can be kind of calming, but we just want to make sure that we've got a little bit of information and understanding about what stretching does and does not do for the body and the nervous system. So if you'd like to go a little bit more deeply into that topic, I've got a couple of articles. One is really short and clear. One is really long and sciencey. You can explore those if you're interested. So up there with the stretch myths are the pain myths. So generally, the way people think about pain is that if you've got pain in your knee, say, that means there's something wrong with your knee. There's some sort of damage around the knee. And in fact, I have written here, it's all in your head. Not really, but kind of. And it's not in your head, meaning that it's imaginary. If you have pain, you have pain. It's real. And it can be quite debilitating if it goes on and on. And I do want to make clear here that when I'm talking about pain in this context, I'm talking about chronic pain, which is typically defined as pain that's gone on longer than something like 3 months or 6 months. So, if you've got a pain in your knee because you just banged your knee on the coffee table, chances are that's why you've got pain in your knee. So I'm talking more about persistent pain. And what's important to understand is that the correlation between the feeling of pain and tissue damage is very, very weak. So there's these really interesting studies that have been done on people with low back pain. Low back pain is incredibly common. And, you got all these people with low back pain and you do an MRI and there's absolutely nothing showing up on the MRI to suggest that there's anything damaged about their backs. At the same time, you have this whole other set of people who have all kinds of crazy things going on, showing up in their MRI, bulging discs, little microfractures, what have you, and they're not experiencing any pain. So the correlation between pain and what's actually happening in your tissues is quite weak. And this is because pain is not something that comes from your tissues and then is sensed by the brain. Pain is actually something that is output by the brain, and the brain decides to output pain based on a whole variety of factors, including, your perception of your own strength and the resiliency of your body, the perception of how much support you think that you have around you, all sorts of factors that may influence whether or not your brain is going to create the sensation of pain. So I have this article by a yoga teacher named Jenny Rawlings linked in the notes here, and it's a really good one. And what I liked about this article when I read it is I could see really strong correlations in the examples she uses. I could really see strong parallels with being a musician in the way she presents the argument. So check that out if you're interested. But just know that if you're in pain, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is some sort of damage in your tissues. It might mean there's damage in your tissues, but often we want to take a multi-pronged and a multifaceted approach to pain. Where you think it is, it ain't. This is a quote by Ida Rolf, who was the creator of the method of body work called Rolfing. She actually called it structural integration, but its kind of nickname or popular name is Rolfing. And I've got written here, every issue is a whole body issue and every solution is a whole body solution. And what I mean here and what she meant is that if you've got pain in your ankle, say, it's not necessarily because there's anything wrong with your ankle, that your ankle is weak or damaged or anything like this. It might be that you've got some instability or weakness in the hips, for example, and that your ankle is just what's starting to feel it. Your ankle is what's starting to give out, but it's not necessarily that, just going in and trying to fix the ankle might not be the most effective long-term solution. So we often have to sort of take, if not a full body approach, then at least a bigger, more global approach to issues. And this is why I sort of advocate just generally for, almost all the movement practices that I do they're whole body practices. They get the whole body involved. So that then we're developing resilience and strength and capability in the entire structure. Regress to progress. This is so important. Sometimes you need to go backwards to go forwards. So let's take an example of any sort of weight-bearing position on your hands. So like tabletop, plank, downward facing dog. Let's pretend if you're in those positions, your wrists hurt. Well, I don't recommend that you just keep doing those movements, hoping one day that your wrists will stop hurting. I would suggest instead you back off and start doing some of the wrist preparation exercises. And if you really can't bear weight on your wrists without pain, then maybe you're doing those exercises at a wall or on a tabletop where there's not quite so much load through the wrists. And this way you really build up the foundation instead of possibly injuring yourself or just developing these weird compensations in other parts of your body. So don't be afraid to go backwards in order to go forwards. I really think so many complicated movements are accessible to many people if you get the right progression. So break it down, folks. Oh, neurological adaptation versus physical adaptation. I think I was actually going to skip this one, but you know what? It's still here. I forgot to erase the slide, so we're just going to talk about it. It's just interesting to understand that the first part of the body to adapt to new movement, and this is particularly relevant when we're talking about building strength. So the first part of you to adapt is your nervous system. So when we begin practicing exercises that require some strength, so like maybe a plank pose or squats or lunges or whatever, they start feeling easier quite quickly. And this is because our nervous system has adapted and our brain understands the movement better, so it's easier for us. And this is a type of strength gain. But what it's important to understand is that it takes the body much longer to actually build muscle, for the connective tissue to get stronger, etc. And depending on the research that you're looking at, this can take anywhere from 3 months, 9 months, a year, even 2 years. So the reason I threw this in here is like, let's pretend you've done all your wrist preparation and you can finally hold a plank pose and it feels pretty good. It feels pretty strong. Your shoulders feel stable. Your wrists feel okay. And so then you start thinking to yourself, oh, well, I'm just going to go on over to the wall and start kicking up into a handstand, say. So this is quite a bit more load on the shoulders and on the wrists and the hands. Well, I would recommend spending some time just playing with the plank pose. So, I'm going to show some locomotor movements involving plank later in the course. Practice holding your plank for longer periods of time. Give your body a chance to catch up. This is a way to progress much more safely. And we got to play the long game. I think that, you always see these things, particularly in the fitness world, like, 6 weeks to a brand new body and all these things. And the reality is it just takes the body a long time to really adapt. So we want to give it that time. And speaking of adaptation, all this said, your body is adaptable and resilient. So, it's really important not to be afraid of movement. You can get stronger, you can heal, you can become more mobile and more flexible. Our bodies are incredibly adaptable. So these are some ideas and information to, help you make good decisions about how you move. And hopefully in many cases, they will embolden you to maybe just not be afraid to move because You're really adaptable. You're really strong. I think that's it. I'm going to scroll forward. Oh, that's not it. I almost forgot about the most important one. Play. I guess this isn't technically movement science, but it's something that I just think is so important. And I think in our culture in general, and particularly in our little microculture of classical music study, we tend to really sort of grind away at things. We're not particularly playful creatures, and it's almost as though we think you're somehow already succeeding if you're working really hard in a really stressed out way. That is a sign that you're crushing it. And I could not disagree more. I think hard work is important, but there is no reason why a lot of hard work can't also be really playful. And I've written here, delayed gratification is for suckers, which is a little bit facetious, also a little bit not. There's no question that if you work really hard at something over a period of time, you will get better at it. But I think we just want to be really careful not to attach to that idea the requirement that therefore whatever you're doing for that long-term payoff, so whatever you're doing now has to kind of suck. And I don't think we necessarily mean to do that, but just check it out in your own experience. Like, do you kind of have this feeling like, in order to get something down the road, that whatever you're doing now has to kind of be unpleasant? And challenge yourself to find ways to make it more playful. I find this to be a really powerful tool for motivation. When I do my movement practice, so I often will go to the gym, and I practice very much in a way at the gym that I'm outlining in this course. I add a few weights in, but for the most part, the arc is quite similar to the one that I'm talking about here. Like at the end of that, I don't want to feel virtuous. I want to feel like I just had a lot of fun, that it was enlivening, that it was energizing. And that's what makes me want to go back the next time. And, you do get better as time goes on. But a lot of times the objectives that we pursue head on, sometimes we can view those more as side effects. If you've got a really good process, the progress is going to happen often as a side effect. So just some thoughts to play with. And that's it. We got a few practice guidelines, a couple of thoughts about equipment, and then we will get into looking at some movement. So I'll see you next time.